In the pre-dawn darkness of the Strait of Hormuz, steel and radar moved in silence. A U.S. aircraft carrier transited the narrow waters, engine steady, decks alive, posture deliberately calm. In this fictional scenario, Iranian commanders faced a decision shaped by fear, signals, and misread intentions. Analysts later assessed that a single order set events in motion, compressing strategy into minutes. For Su-35s lifted off, not to wage war, but to test resolve, timing, and distance. Military planners imagined the next half-hour unfolding faster than diplomacy could breathe. Because for 29 minutes, detection, reaction, and restraint collided, and the margin between deterrence and disaster became terrifyingly thin. That edge defined choices, consequences, and futures nobody fully controlled or predicted then. In this fictional scenario, the strategic backdrop was already brittle long before any aircraft left the ground. According to simulated wargaming models later reviewed by analysts, the Strait of Hormuz had entered a phase where perception mattered as much as intent. Naval movements that would normally be routine were being interpreted through a lens of suspicion, shaped by weeks of rhetoric, satellite imagery, and intelligence estimates that reinforced worst-case assumptions on both sides. From the American perspective, the carrier's transit was deliberate and methodical. Carrier strike groups are designed to operate under constant observation, and this passage was no exception. The U.S. Navy's posture emphasized readiness without provocation. Escorts maintained layered defensive spacing, airborne early warning assets orbited at altitude, and combat air patrols cycled on predictable schedules. Military planners imagined this visibility as stabilizing. The message was presence, not escalation. Iranian planners, however, interpreted the same signals very differently. In this fictional construct, intelligence officers briefed senior commanders on what they believed was a convergence of indicators. Increased carrier aviation tempo, heightened communications traffic, and the rumored movement of long-range strike assets were assessed as preparatory steps rather than coincidence. Analysts later assessed that confirmation bias played a decisive role. Each new data point was filtered through the assumption that confrontation was imminent. Inside hardened command facilities, decision-making compressed under pressure. The core dilemma was timing. If American forces were positioning to strike later, waiting could leave Iran reacting from a position of disadvantage. Military planners imagined a narrow window in which action could alter the balance, not by defeating a carrier outright, but by demonstrating the ability to threaten it. The objective, as framed in these simulations, was deterrence through risk creation. That logic led planners to consider their most modern air assets. The Su-35s, recently integrated into service, represented a leap in capability compared to legacy platforms. In wargaming scenarios, these aircraft were not portrayed as decisive weapons, but as tools capable of forcing reactions. Their speed, sensors, and payload allowed them to approach contested zones quickly, test defenses, and withdraw before sustained engagement. The mission intent was not conquest, but signaling under fire control conditions. The launch decision reflected this calculus. Analysts later imagined that commanders viewed the sortie as a probe that could still be contained. 4 aircraft were deemed sufficient to demonstrate reach while limiting exposure. The planners assumed that speed, low-altitude routing, and electronic discipline would delay detection long enough to compress the response timeline. The success of the mission depended less on destruction and more on forcing the opposing commander into a rapid decision cycle. As the Su-35s departed, the American side remained unaware of the specific intent but not blind to anomalies. Carrier strike groups operate on the assumption that the battle space is always contested. Sensors constantly sought noise from signal. In this fictional narrative, initial radar returns appeared intermittent and ambiguous, consistent with civilian traffic or atmospheric clutter. No alarms were raised immediately. The watch teams followed procedure, logging and correlating contacts rather than reacting prematurely. The turning point came when those fleeting signals began to align. According to military planners' imagined timelines, multiple sensors detected consistent movement vectors at low altitude and high speed. Data links fused inputs from shipboard radars and airborne early warning platforms. What emerged was not certainty, but concern. The geometry did not match commercial profiles, and the speed exceeded typical regional traffic. At this stage, decision-making shifted from routine monitoring to defensive readiness. Combat information centers adjusted threat matrices, assigning provisional classifications while maintaining restraint. Analysts later noted that this phase is where escalation risk peaks. A misclassification could trigger an unnecessary response, while hesitation could narrow reaction windows. Commanders are trained to operate within that ambiguity, but the margin for error is thin. The Iranian aircraft, in this fictional construct, remained committed once the point of no return was crossed. Fuel, routing, and timing locked the mission into motion. Turning back too early would signal weakness, pressing forward carried obvious risk. Military planners imagined pilots focused on execution rather than outcome, trusting that systems and planning would buy them the seconds required to act. As the range closed, American sensors resolved the contacts more clearly. Classification shifted from unknown to hostile probable, triggering higher alert states across the strike group. This transition was procedural, not emotional. Analysts emphasize that modern naval defense is less about panic and more about sequencing actions correctly under time pressure. By the time definitive identification occurred, the engagement clock had already started. According to simulated timelines, the difference between detection and decisive action was measured in minutes, not hours. The stage was set for the next phase, where technology, training, and timing would determine whether the encounter remained a demonstration or cascaded into something far more dangerous. This first contact phase illustrates the central lesson of the scenario. Escalation does not begin with explosions. It begins with interpretation. Each side believed it was reacting defensively, yet each reaction narrowed the space for de-escalation. What followed would test every layer of modern naval defense and expose how quickly strategic signaling can slide toward irreversible consequences. In this fictional scenario, the engagement moved from abstraction to action in a matter of moments. According to simulated wargaming models, once the approaching aircraft crossed a specific range threshold, the problem ceased to be political and became mathematical. Distances, speeds, angles, and seconds replaced rhetoric. Commanders no longer debated intent, they prepared to stop trajectories. Analysts later assessed that this phase is where modern naval warfare reveals its true character. No single system is decisive. Survival depends on layers, redundancy, and timing. Each layer exists not to guarantee success, but to buy time for the next. The first clear indicator came when the approaching aircraft altered profile. In the simulation, the Su-35s briefly climbed from low altitude, a maneuver designed to expand sensor coverage and enable weapons release. That climb lasted seconds, but it was enough. Multiple sensors confirmed intent, and the engagement shifted instantly from tracking to response. Missile launches followed almost immediately. According to military planners' imagined timelines, anti-ship missiles separated from their pylons in rapid succession, accelerating to supersonic speed within moments. From launch to potential impact, the window was brutally narrow. Analysts later calculated that from the carrier's perspective, the entire inbound threat would compress into little more than a minute of continuous decision-making. The outer defensive layer activated first. Aegis-equipped escorts assumed primary responsibility, their radars refining tracks and assigning intercept solutions. Standard missiles launched vertically, arcing high before turning back toward the sea-skimming threats. This phase was not about precision, it was about reducing volume. Every intercept at distance extended the survival timeline by precious seconds. In this fictional construct, some intercepts succeeded early. Explosions flared far from the carrier, reducing the number of inbound missiles. But wargaming models rarely allow perfect outcomes. Several threats continued through the outer layer, descending to wave-top altitude where radar horizons shrink and reaction times collapse. As the engagement tightened, the carrier itself began evasive maneuvers. Analysts emphasize that aircraft carriers are not passive targets. In simulations, changes in course and speed complicate missile guidance, forcing seekers to adjust continuously. These maneuvers are coordinated with escort positioning, creating overlapping fields of fire while minimizing predictable geometry. The mid-layer defenses then took over. Rolling airframe missiles engaged targets that had slipped through earlier intercepts. These systems operate at closer range, prioritizing speed and agility over reach. In the modeled scenario, their effectiveness depended on precise coordination between sensors and launchers, a choreography practiced repeatedly in peacetime but tested here under extreme compression. Near-miss moments defined this phase. Military planners imagined missiles adjusting course mid-flight, responding to countermeasures and maneuvering ships. Each adjustment forced defenders to recalculate firing solutions. Analysts later noted that this is where uncertainty peaks. Even with automation, humans remain in the loop, validating decisions made in fractions of a second. The innermost layer represented the final margin. Close-in weapon systems and electronic countermeasures worked simultaneously, saturating the immediate space around the carrier with defensive fire and deception. In simulations, this layer is designed not as a primary shield, but as a last opportunity to deflect or disrupt a threat that has already beaten multiple odds. In this fictional engagement, one missile penetrated deeper than the rest. Analysts later highlighted this moment as the most dangerous of the entire sequence. The difference between impact and miss came down to marginal adjustments, electronic interference, chaff dispersal, and slight changes in the carrier's heading. Wargaming models showed that even a few degrees of deviation could alter the outcome entirely. When the immediate inbound threat ended, there was no celebration. According to planners, the absence of impact did not mean the danger had passed. The system shifted instantly from defense to assessment. Damage control teams evaluated sensors and systems. Air wings prepared for follow-on action. Commanders recalculated risk, knowing that the initial engagement was only one part of a larger decision tree. What this phase demonstrated, analysts later argued, was not invincibility but fragility managed through preparation. Every defensive success depended on systems functioning as intended under extraordinary pressure. Had any layer failed completely, the outcome would have been dramatically different. This is why the scenario's 29 minutes mattered. The engagement itself lasted only a fraction of that time, but its implications stretched far beyond. The missile phase compressed decades of technological development into seconds of consequence. It showed how modern naval warfare leaves almost no room for correction once a threshold is crossed. By the end of this phase, escalation was no longer hypothetical. An attack had been attempted, defenses had responded, and the next decisions would determine whether the encounter remained contained or expanded outward. The battlefield shifted from missiles in the air to aircraft in pursuit and diplomats on alert, setting the stage for what followed. In this fictional scenario, the moment the inbound threat was neutralized, the battle space did not relax. According to simulated wargaming models, the end of missile flight marked the beginning of a more dangerous phase, pursuit. Once weapons are launched, ambiguity collapses. Commanders must assume hostile intent until proven otherwise, and the priority shifts to preventing a second strike while maintaining control over escalation. American aircraft were already airborne when the defensive engagement concluded. Combat air patrols that had been positioned for routine overwatch were redirected based on fused sensor data. Analysts later assessed that speed mattered less than positioning. The objective was not vengeance, but containment, ensuring the attacking aircraft could not regroup, rearm, or return with additional assets. The retreating fighters faced immediate constraints. In the simulated timeline, fuel margins had narrowed due to low-altitude ingress and high-speed maneuvering. Their sensors were saturated with warnings as opposing radar and fire control systems focused attention on them. Military planners imagined pilots confronting a stark reality. Outrunning modern interceptors was unlikely, and continued resistance risked rapid loss. The first engagement unfolded quickly. Beyond visual range weapons were employed not as instruments of dominance, but as tools of denial. Analysts emphasized that modern air combat often ends before adversaries ever see each other. In this scenario, one aircraft was disabled at distance, its pilot forced to eject. The outcome reinforced a core lesson of contemporary warfare. Survivability depends as much on timing and information as on performance. As the pursuit continued, the remaining aircraft faced diminishing options. According to planners, the choice narrowed to escape or survival through disengagement. Emergency procedures replaced tactical ambition. 2 aircraft attempted immediate recovery at nearby airfields under stress conditions, resulting in severe damage but preserved lives. Analysts later pointed out that these decisions reflected professional discipline under extreme pressure rather than failure. With the aerial phase concluded, attention shifted rapidly to strategic consequences. In this fictional construct, command authorities recognized that while assets had been lost or damaged, a larger catastrophe had been avoided. The absence of casualties created a narrow opening for de-escalation, but the political implications were unavoidable. Immediate posture adjustments followed. Additional forces were repositioned not as signals of retaliation, but as insurance against miscalculation. According to military planners, reinforcing presence after an incident serves 2 functions: deterrence and reassurance. It communicates resolve while stabilizing allies who may interpret silence as weakness. Simultaneously, diplomatic channels activated. Analysts later imagined back-channel communications opening within hours, facilitated by intermediaries accustomed to crisis management. These conversations did not focus on blame. They focused on preventing repetition. Each side needed assurances that the incident would not become precedent. The narrative battle began almost immediately. Public statements were measured, emphasizing restraint and control. In wargaming assessments, this phase is as critical as the engagement itself. Poor messaging can undo tactical success by inflaming public pressure and narrowing political options. Leaders must balance transparency with ambiguity, revealing enough to deter but not enough to provoke. International reactions compounded the pressure. Energy markets reacted to perceived instability. Regional partners sought clarification. Global powers with interests in the region urged calm while recalculating their own positions. Analysts later assessed that the risk of horizontal escalation, conflict spreading beyond the immediate participants, was nearly as dangerous as vertical escalation into open war. What emerged in the aftermath was not triumph, but caution. The scenario underscored how modern military systems compress decision-making into minutes while political consequences unfold over weeks. The same technologies that provide protection also accelerate escalation, leaving little room for correction once thresholds are crossed. The enduring lesson, military planners argued, was not about superiority but restraint. Systems worked as designed, yet the outcome remained perilously close to disaster. The difference between containment and catastrophe hinged on marginal choices made under intense pressure by individuals operating within complex systems. By the end of the simulated 29-minute window, the immediate crisis had passed, but its implications lingered. The encounter illustrated how quickly deterrence can become confrontation, and how confrontation can be pulled back only through discipline and communication. In this fictional scenario, the world stepped back from the edge, not because escalation was impossible, but because it was narrowly avoided. That is the unsettling truth revealed by the scenario. Modern warfare does not announce itself with declarations. It emerges from signals misread, timelines compressed, and decisions made with incomplete information. And once it begins, even stopping it can feel like navigating in darkness, guided by systems that allow survival but never guarantee safety. Before you leave, it's important to remember what you just watched. This was a fictional military scenario, built around real-world systems, doctrines, and capabilities, but not a real historical event. It exists to explore how close modern powers can come to catastrophe when technology, fear, and timing collide. The real question isn't who would win in a confrontation like this. It's how easily one could begin. When minutes matter more than messages, and when systems react faster than diplomacy can respond, the margin for error becomes dangerously thin. Deterrence is meant to prevent war, but miscalculation can turn it into the spark that ignites one. So ask yourself, did anything here feel unrealistic, or did it feel uncomfortably plausible? Do advanced defenses make the world safer, or do they simply encourage riskier behavior? And in an era where decisions are compressed into seconds, can restraint still hold? Share your thoughts in the comments. Debate the strategy, the assumptions, and the lessons, but do it thoughtfully. Because understanding how escalation happens is one of the few tools we have to prevent it. History isn't always changed by grand plans. Sometimes, it turns on a handful of minutes.